Hello, I'm Chris Warburton of Ecstasy, the Battle of Rave, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them.
Welcome to the first episode of MetaPod. I'm Wendy Morrill.
And I'm Kevin May.
And you can join us here each week for a new conversation with creators of the web's best podcasts.
That's right. We've got some excellent podcasts lined up for MetaPod's first season of episodes. And you can find out what's coming up next by checking our website, metapodshow.com, and following us on Twitter. That's at the MetaPod Show.
To kick off the party at MetaPod, it could be no other podcast and presenter than Chris Warburton and Ecstasy, the Battle of Rave. Ecstasy is the BBC's fantastic, multi-episode documentary come drama look at the emergence of rave culture in England in the late 1980s. But we'll come back to that in a minute.
Yes, we will, including our interview with Chris. Now, some of you might be asking, what on earth is MetaPod all about, and why should I listen to another podcast? Good questions, we would say. Right, so like the backstories for each of our weekly guests, we have one of our own. When the lockdowns around the world started in the early months of last year, we, like millions of others, started listening to many more podcasts on our daily walks and when stuck in our homes for days on end.
Kev and I, in the midst of assembling amusing lists of favorite gigs or whatever else we could think of, would say, "Hey, have you listened to this podcast?" We'd then swap recommendations, pick apart the ones we'd been listening to, and generally immerse ourselves in conversational topics miles away from the stuff of our day jobs. If you're interested in what we do when not doing this, then you can go to the MetaPod website and read about us.
So after months of this, we decided that rather than listening to ourselves, analysing our favourite shows, and often wondering about the characters that created them, wouldn't it be great to actually talk to these hosts and unpack, as we say, the stories behind these fantastic podcasts?
And that's it, really. That's MetaPod. And after months of research and recording, we're finally here with our first episode.
Yep. Now, for me, this is all kind of strange because I've been listening to our first guest, that's Chris Warburton, for years on the radio, as he's a presenter on BBC Radio 5 Live here in the UK, where I live. You'll hear him mention previous podcasts that he created called End of Days, about the Waco story and David Koresh, which was both disturbing and terrific. And I'm sure many of you will have listened to it already.
In the summer of 2020, Chris and his colleagues released Ecstasy, the Battle of Rave. It's different from his earlier work in the podcast realm, but has been widely praised for its creativity and detail.
You'll notice earlier that we said multi-episode when describing the show. That's because the numbering on the BBC website says there are 6 episodes, whereas actually there are 6 documentary-style shows and 6 fictional stories. There are a bunch of other episodes which are great, including an ace mix from one of the DJs of that particular era, known as Graham Park.
We spoke to Chris in November last year and really enjoyed getting some of the background on how the podcast came together, as well as exploring some of the issues that are raised in the podcast.
So that's it from us for now. We really hope you enjoyed this, our very first episode of MetaPod, and especially hearing about Ecstasy, the Battle of Rave.
Start the tape.
So thank you so much, Chris, for joining us on MetaPod to talk to us about your podcast. Now, I say this very, very respectfully, and I was pretty scared about listening to this podcast, and I'll tell you why. Actually, I mean, I'll put on record now that I think it's fantastic. It's a really brilliant podcast.
Thank you.
But I'll tell you why I was worried. A lot of my buddies from the 90s, who I may have gone disco dancing with on occasion, were saying, you've got to listen to this podcast. It's great. There's loads of tunes in it. There's loads of great stories and everything. And before I started listening to it, I thought my memory of that period, I mean, I was probably not quite in Northern Warehouse rave period. I was, I started going clubbing in the early 90s and stuff. So I wasn't quite there. But my memories of that are all very kind of, it was with my mates and I had really good times and all that kind of stuff. And I thought to myself, I don't want something which is billing itself as a kind of a history of an era almost to kind of sour my memory of it. And luckily it didn't at all. It enhanced it. It was terrific. But my question to kick us off first, Chris, is how do you approach something of this level when you know that particular era and what it did culturally means so much to people?
Well, it's so interesting you put it all like that, because that was, I suppose, underneath all of the production and the writing and the audio gathering, our great fear all the way through, if I'm honest, that when it came to launch day, people would say, this isn't how it is at all. And we would have had the rug pulled from underneath us immediately. And that would have just been completely disastrous. And when you're talking about a period like this, which means so much to so many people on such an emotional level for a lot of people who were there at the time, then you really are, it's a big responsibility. It's a really big responsibility. And I think during every step of making of the podcast, we were so aware of resorting to cliche sometimes and thinking no, and stopping ourselves at those moments in time. Are we giving fair representation to this particular side of the story? Are we going overboard on that particular side of the story? And, you know, when it was building up to launch day, I think Kieran, Tracy and I in particular, Emma Ford, who was one of the other producers, the main producer really, we were slightly terrified that when it came to dropping it, you know, and building up to that was just, ugh. But as soon as it then happened and we started getting the responses that we had from people who were there, luckily, in the same vein as you were talking about your mates saying, you got to listen to this podcast. Suddenly we thought, we got it right. But yeah, I mean, when you approach it, it's about research at the end of the day, isn't it? But it's also being absolutely honest with your listeners. We were very clear, and we addressed this very early on in the podcast as well, to say this isn't the history of the whole period. We are not giving you the history of Acid House. We didn't want to do that because I think sometimes that could become rather prosaic in its nature anyway, you know, and you're then suddenly you're leaning on journalists, social historians, all those kind of figures in order to actually do it justice if you're trying to tell a story like that. So we were very, very clear from the start that we wanted it to be a character-led storytelling exercise ultimately. And, you know, again, I found this with all of the podcasts I've done, you set out to find the best contributors you can, but it's only when you first start getting those early interviews in the can that you start thinking, okay, we really could be onto something here. And I totally began to feel that after we got about 3 or 4 interviews done. I thought, okay, well, not only are we going to do the period justice, but we're going to do it in a really intriguing and colourful fashion.
Tell me, Chris, if you can, I mean, what was the trigger for it? I mean, was there an anniversary of something coming up? I mean, whose bright idea was it to suddenly go, you know what, let's do a story that brings all these elements together. Oh, and we'll do some fictional stuff as well.
Yeah, well, these things always come about in stranger ways, don't they, than you would imagine. And I think after each podcast I've done, people immediately start saying, what's the next one? What are you going to do next? And you think, I have absolutely no idea. And you go away and you start researching in different ways, you know, looking here and there and thinking, is there something in that? Is there something in that? And, you know, generally we've probably pitched a couple of things before we get the nod on the next project ultimately. So there's failures along the way. With this one, I mean, I'm a big music fan and I started looking back and thinking, is there... What happened with the one before we did this? I did a podcast on Waco. It was called End of Days. It was David Koresh's story. And the way we told it, without going into excruciating detail, was to follow the story of the British people who got caught up in that. And people really liked it because they said, I thought we knew this story, but I really didn't. And this was a completely different angle to it. And I thought, well, I love music and I love music culture. And I wonder if there's a particular period which people think they know, but perhaps they don't really or know every single detail of it. And so I started sort of playing around with that a little bit. And then there were various kind of podcasts that were incorporating bits of drama. So Forest 404, for example, that started melding around with different ideas. And I'm quite intrigued by that. And I'm mates with a guy called Danny Brocklehurst, who wrote the dramatic episodes of our podcast. Danny's a brilliant screenwriter, and he lives where I live in Greater Manchester. And we were just in the pub. Oh, remember those days when you were just in the pub? Wow.
She would just have a moment.
Have a moment on that, halcyon days, with a cool beer, talking on the same sofa. And we just started talking. And weirdly enough, Danny started then talking about the fact that he had been interested in doing something around that era as well. And he had had a few ideas here and there. And all of a sudden we started saying, well, is there something you and I can do together? And I think he had always fancied the idea of, getting involved with the podcast in one way or another. And before we knew it, we then came up with the idea of trying to produce something that was factual and drama all together. And that was the original idea, that each episode was going to be factual, and then you would have bits of drama bleeding into it, and then you'd be back to the factual. And we thought, this is going to be brilliant. And we were thinking, I have no idea how we're going to do this, but I'm sure we'll be able to, and it'll be brilliant. And after a short while, we thought, no, we're really not going to be able to do that. It's going to be impossible. And partly that was because a lot of the characters that we were beginning to meet, the real life characters, were almost fictional in the way they are. As people who have listened to the podcast will know, John Burton, the drug dealer, Tommy Smith, the rave organizer in Blackburn, these are people who speak in such a sort of lyrical fashion, and the kind of things they come out with. And Sean Ryder, it's like a quote every time they open their mouth. So, to then say, oh, let's bring in dramatic characters as well, the listener would have absolutely no idea what was going on.
So they're almost parodies of themselves, aren't they, in a way, some of the real characters, because as you say, they kind of talk in that jargon. Wendy,
I'm just wondering, two parts here, that it's a really tight time period. Did you start out like that, or did you have to really distill that down? And were there other characters you wanted to dramatize, but you're like, no, it doesn't fit, or we've got that person in real life here?
Sure. Well, in terms of the time period, I think we became aware pretty quickly that there was a kind of rise and fall in the period of time that we focus on. Yeah. And that absolutely then became, the kind of laser focus of all of our storytelling, really, and for all of our contributors to kind of fit into that narrative, if you like, over that period of time. And that was actually really, rather than being restrictive, it was really liberating, because we then knew exactly where and when everybody's story kind of needed to end, really. Right. And it gave us a much clearer structure as to where we needed to be at each point over each episode, really. So that really worked out for us. And I think, there'll be people, I again was slightly worried that people would listen to it going, well, hang on a minute, you're almost talking like rave culture came to an end in like 1990, 1991. I was out raving in 95. People haven't really said that. And I think it's probably because we explained quite clearly that, again, this isn't the history. This is these people's stories. And that was when their stories were coming to an end. In answer to your question about whether there was a fictional story that we didn't end up telling, not so much. But I'll tell you what there was. We actually had another factual story that we cut out of the podcast because it became too complicated. There was a whole other storyline, which was basically about a mule who was a drug dealer from the Netherlands, who initially agreed to bringing drugs into the UK and bringing ecstasy in big numbers. But then it all got quite violent, and he was threatened into continuing to do that work. And in the end, it became a smuggling operation that had really kind of national and international significance. Like, I don't want to sort of just give you tidbits of the story because it's really, really involved. The problem we had, even though it was really a fascinating part of the tale, in the end, it just became so difficult to weave into what was such an intriguing story happening in the UK from the point of view of the rave organizers and from the point of view of law enforcement and the gangsters coming into the whole scene. And we had that beautiful arc that was developing in all of those characters, and to suddenly shoehorn in this quite complicated story of a Dutch lorry driver just became harder and harder and harder. you know, that shows actually on behalf in particular of the editor of the podcast, Kieran Tracy, a discipline which you really have to show in the end. And I remember him just messaging me one day and just saying, "That's it, we're cutting it, it's gone, it's gone, it's gone." And I thought to myself, again, you know, it's quite a liberating moment when you think, okay, we don't need to worry about that anymore, because the bottom line is, and we've said this in every podcast we've ever done, the listener has no idea what's on the cutting room floor.
Yeah. I mean, you have a fair number of well-known people appearing in the podcast, but how did you find the not so well-known people?
Well, in a series of different ways. I mean, there have been some excellent books written about that period, for one thing, which was a really, really good source. Altered State is one particular book, which tells a similar kind of story. It goes into more detail, but, you know, there's all sorts of different sources. Obviously, a lot of the newspaper cuttings from the time, for example, there have been other documentaries that have been done over this period as well. Some of those people, Tommy Smith, for example, has hardly ever spoken about the role that he played in all of this. And that was so beneficial for us because in a way, he's almost the main character of the piece. He's the kind of, I don't know, the idealist that runs through the thread of the whole pod. And he's such an engaging character. And like with all of these things, it's the same as when you're sort of going through a news gathering process. One person leads to another person, leads on to another person, and before you know it, you're finding the real kind of gold, if you like. I think one thing that we found from the production process, and I joked about this at the time, and I almost wanted to include it as part of the podcast, is that everybody that we spoke to, everybody that we interviewed would turn around and go, "Now, you know who you need to speak to." You need to speak to so-and-so, and be like, yeah, okay. Have you spoken to so? You can't do this podcast without speaking to so-and-so. And you'd be like, okay, thanks a lot. And I remember even when we were sort of knee deep in the production process and it's getting to that quite stressful time where, you know, there are times when you're getting a bit stuck in it all and it's not quite moving in the way you want it to be. And everybody's got their own personal stresses going on, particularly when we were in the middle of the whole pandemic. I remember speaking to my brother and filling him in. He's 4 years older than me. So he was more, you know, into the whole sort of period of time. And he went, "Oh, you know who you want to speak to." And I was like, "Not you as well, mate, honestly." So we were, in a way, we were spoiled for choice, but we were lucky to drill down and get people who, I don't think there was really a weak voice in the entire thing, if I'm absolutely honest.
I agree. And on that point, Chris, I think it's quite interesting, you know, because of all these people that were saying, you know, you should talk to so-and-so in Blackburn or in Bolton or whatever. Did you find anyone through that process that you just didn't think would be in the original kind of spec when you were planning it out?
I think one of the people who sort of came out of nowhere was the DJ Rob Tissera, in as much as we did a long interview with him about what life was like at the beginning of the Acid House movement. And I don't think we fully appreciated that when we come to the final confrontation between the police and the ravers at the rave just outside Leeds, which is almost the kind of curtain coming down on that particular era and the curtain coming down on a lot of the contributors to our podcast. He was actually on the decks at the moment that the police were outside the warehouse where the rave was taking place, and almost kind of incited the crowd to respond to the police. And that was such an incredible kind of first-hand account of someone who was not only massively embedded in the music, but, you know, understood that battle between the police and ravers at that time absolutely intrinsically. And I don't know, just little nuggets like that, which just add to the whole text of the piece, were really, really invaluable. So, you know, people like him who just sort of pop out of nowhere were great.
Can you tell us about the photo that was chosen for the artwork of the podcast? Is there a story there?
It's not a massive story. I think I think, to be honest, it's quite a boring answer. I think it's a stock photo, basically, of that time. It wasn't me back in the period or anything like that. So I have absolutely no idea who that chap is. And every time I look at it, I think to myself, I wonder if you even know that you're there. on the front cover of a podcast that more than 1 million people have listened to on Sounds now. I have no idea. I mean, maybe he'll be a sort of, accountant living in the Surrey commuter belt now. I've got absolutely no idea. I suppose we were kind of given quite a lot of art ideas that you wouldn't believe the process that kind of goes through to pick the art for these kind of things, the agony over the different imagery and the letter type and all these kind of things. And you just think, oh my God, it fries your brain. But initially we were sort of looking at all of the yellow and the kind of hacienda colors, and obviously there was the suggestion of whether we have a happy smiley face and whether it goes down that road, and you and you are, and back and forth, and instead we ended up with this poor fellow who's off his noggin at some point in the 1980s.
The reason why Wendy and I were laughing so much is that we had a fairly robust discussion about that question a couple of days ago, because I said, it ended up might just being a stock photo,
You did.
Yeah.
All
right. Okay. I'm sorry. I wish
you
there
win
was
the bet, Kevin.
I win the bet. So
you won the bet. I wish there was a more romantic story behind it, and I can only apologise, Wendy.
It would only have been better, Chris, if it was you. But,
yes,
as we know, it wasn't. I'm interested. The timing of the release of this podcast, as we know, came out, but we were in this kind of pandemic period, mid-pandemic period, and I wonder whether the timing of it kind of has fed into the kind of enthusiasm that people have had for it, because there is this kind of lockdown nostalgia.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
I do. I mean, we had long conversations again about, when we were going to release it, because I was worried that every conversation I seemed to be having with anybody who knew anything about what was happening with podcasts over the period of COVID was that people weren't listening to the things, because, people aren't commuting. And that is where a lot of the podcast market obviously comes from. And so people aren't in their cars, people aren't on the trains, people aren't walking to the office, they're not listening to podcasts. And I kept on saying, do we really want to, release a podcast at that particular moment in time? I also thought to myself, well, if we do release it and no one listens to it, we could turn around and go, well, it's because no one's commuting, right? I mean, that's it's nothing to do with the quality of the podcast. I thought it makes the perfect excuse, actually. But in the end, I think you're absolutely spot on. And so much of the feedback that we've had from people, and even if it's just tweets that I've gone and seen on Twitter or whatever it might be, it has been so many people saying it has just been a beautiful escape. It has been a step into a happier time of my life. It has been a step away from having to think about news and the constant, soaking of COVID everywhere we go. And actually, on a working level, I felt quite similar to that as well, because as I think both of you know, my day job is as a presenter on 5 Live, and my life has been dominated by talking about COVID, obviously, over the past however many months now. And to work on this during the period of lockdown was a really, really nice release for me as well. So I can completely sympathize or understand exactly how some of our listeners were feeling as they got into listening to it. But yeah, I think that's been a really nice part of it, that it's been a little bit of a had a slightly deeper meaning to it in terms of people's enjoyment than just going, oh yeah, it was a cool podcast, passed the time, enjoyed it. There was something more to it, and a I don't know, were we providing a public service for people? Maybe, hopefully,
The binge factor is pretty high on this one, I would say. I mean, you put all episodes out at once, right? Was that a clear decision that you discussed, or just get it out there?
I never know what's the best thing to do, to be honest. The first podcast I did was a thing called Beyond Reasonable Doubt, which was a true crime podcast. And we were making that as we followed the story. So sometimes we would do an episode and then we'd say, look, don't know if there's going to be one next week. There might be one in a couple of weeks. That was an exhilarating way of making a podcast. It was so amazing for it to be running through your life like that. I never really know if it's wise to drop it all at once or to gradually eke them out. I think sometimes, if you're relying on people, say you put out one every week, we would be talking about 13 episodes. Well, that's trying to hold people's attention for 3 months ultimately, which I think you sometimes lose. And I think people get a bit impatient at times as well. I know I can be a bit like that. So I understand if that's how other people can be. And I'm terrible. I can be really into a podcast that maybe might be 10 episodes long. and I'll get to 8 and I'll be like, oh, I'm really enjoying this. And then a few weeks later, you know, maybe a few months later, I'll go, oh, I never got to 9 or 10 in that podcast, you know. I have no idea why. And then it feels a bit weird going back to it. So no, I felt quite comfortable with the idea of doing this. I mean, one of the weird things is the number of people who have got back and said, I listened to all of the factual episodes in one go. And I think, that's like 6 hours. Was that you, Wendy? I mean, that's incredibly good going. You know? Back to back. So, I mean, but again, you know, what could be a better kind of recommendation than somebody saying that?
Well, I would have to go for a break out to the living room to tell my partner, you'll never guess what was in the episode about Amsterdam.
That's good.
And they got the tram sound in there too.
Yes, we did. We did.
You did.
I did a really cheesy walk and talk through Amsterdam, and it was one of those. As I was doing it, I was thinking, "This is good. You're doing good here, man." The voice in my head was kind of, "Yeah, you're really nailing it." And then I listened back to it. I just thought, "This is absolute crap," and just full of the worst Amsterdam cliches. But there you go. That's the perils of trying to do good reporting.
I mean, while we're on Amsterdam, was there something in particular that struck you while you were here or doing the research about that piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, I mean, I've been to Amsterdam quite a few times in life, and, you know, for various reasons. And I genuinely never thought that I would end up in Amsterdam talking to a kind of major drugs figure in one of those brown bars. I just never thought that would happen in my life. But then, you know, quite a lot of odd things have happened in my life through my work, and you never know where it's going to take you, which is the beauty of the profession, I suppose. But yeah, going out there to meet Steve Brown, who was the kind of mega dealer, the man who says he was the first person to really kind of bring ecstasy into Amsterdam and then facilitate its movement around Europe and obviously into the UK. That was a hell of a day. And it was just before lockdown. And I just remember getting on the plane and thinking, things are getting a bit weird here. And then arriving in Amsterdam, getting to Schiphol, getting to our hotel. We were only staying one night. And actually, this is kind of boring detail, but we were moving house that week as well. And my wife was away in London that week. So my head was exploding with stress. Sure. It was all very, very stressful. And we got there, and I remember getting to the hotel, turning on the telly. Everybody was talking about COVID. I could tell, even in Dutch there, I could tell they were talking about COVID. And then we were gradually meeting guests, and it was the first time I was doing the kind of elbow handshakes or elbow high fives or whatever the hell you want to call that. And everybody was sort of on edge, and it was all a bit mad. And then just to add to all of that, I'm talking to this very unusual and colorful character. But again, you know, it was one of those ones that when you're talking to him, you're thinking, this is bloody great. You know, this is going to be brilliant for the podcast. He's absolute gold. So yeah, I look back on that now. It's almost like a sort of dream-like couple of days, if I'm absolutely honest.
I'm curious, you know all about balance working for the BBC. And I'm curious, when you started, almost going to say storyboarding the story, did you consciously think about, we want to talk about a lot of the euphoric stuff because there's plenty of that, but we also want to talk about some of the stuff that's really very moving, whether it was the fictional pieces that Danny wrote, or it's the stories that came back from people? Did that happen by accident, or was there a conscious decision?
No, I mean, it was entirely conscious right from the start. Again, you know, alongside the fears of not standing up in terms of credibility, that was the thing that we were most aware of and fearful about, I suppose, because, you know, if we had released a podcast which people had turned around and said, hold on a second, you know, this is the BBC and they sound like they're glorifying a Class A drug. You've just got a series of people who are saying how brilliant it was to, you know, be in that moment and all the rest of it, then that wouldn't have been great. But at the same time, I was, you know, really, really fearful about, I feel maybe just pushing it a bit too far, but I was just anxious, I suppose, of coming across as the po-faced BBC, and people turn around and go, oh my God, look at them trying to tell a story about Ecstasy and Acid House, and all they're doing is wagging their finger at us in a very BBC way. So, you know, the balance of that whole process of balancing those two factors up was massive all the way through. The BBC's got its own editorial policy unit. Ed Poll is what everybody calls it for short. You know, program makers will speak to them all the time in day-to-day radio. 5 Live, we're constantly speaking to Ed Poll on all sorts of items you'll do. I think we were one of Ed Poll's worst nightmares during all of this process. And they would go through a lot of what we were doing with a relatively, you know, fine-tooth comb, because the problem is, the challenge, should I say, is that a lot of the people we were speaking to were, as you're saying, euphoric about that period in their life. You know, this was a vibrant time. It was a kaleidoscopic period. It was a revolutionary moment for a lot of them. And yes, it was also drug fueled for a lot of those people. Ecstasy played a massive part in it, not for everyone, but for a lot of people. So we needed to reflect some of that. You know, we had to reflect that this was the greatest times of their lives, and that these are people who were evangelical about it. However, we were also aware that by the end of the story, there's quite a lot of regret from some of the central figures, whether that was in a criminal sense from the main drug dealer, John Burton, for example, or from some of the rave organizers because of the stress that whole period put them under, whether it was under pressure from the police or whether it was from the drug dealers or whether it was from tragedy, you know. And we hear from the best friend of Janet Mays, the 21-year-old woman who was only the second person to die from ecstasy. And we dedicated half an episode to mark that death. And something like that required an awful lot of thought from us, because it requires, you don't want it to be a sudden gear change away from the general sound of the podcast, right? And so therefore it requires creative writing, it requires clever production. And I don't think there is a big gear change in the whole thing. We wanted people to reflect and be aware that there wasn't just one big party, but we also didn't want to completely clobber people over the head with that fact, if you see what I mean. And I think I resort back to this at the end of the day. We warn people that there's going to be bad language and drug references. And I think this is adult listening. You know, there's adults in the room. We're talking about a class A drug. Yes. You know, we did not have to, but we were advised that there were moments during the podcast where we would need to take stock on what we've just heard. And, you know, for people who have listened, there are moments where there's almost sort of a plea from us for you to be aware that, for example, various things you're hearing would have obviously have been criminal behavior. You know, various things you'll hear was obviously risky behavior in terms of drug use. And there were some times where, you know, I guess sometimes you could get caught up in the whole production of it, because there's the music, because there's all the characters, and you'd want to go along with that. You're on the crest of the wave in terms of storytelling, and you'd be like, yeah. And then I would turn to Kieran and I'd say, would we sound like this if we were talking about Coke, for example? You know, if we were doing a story about cocaine, would we sound as kind of, hey, yeah, as the BBC? Probably not. They're both class A drugs. So we need to take a step back in how we're talking about this particular part of storytelling. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, that's really interesting. That balance is, and you do nail it throughout.
Thanks.
It's interesting. You said you don't drop people off a cliff from talking about something that's very euphoric, and then all of a sudden it's doom and gloom. It's much more kind of subtle than that. I mean, but with that in mind, was there anything that you were asked to change as a result of it perhaps being a little too extreme on one end or the other?
I mean, there were various bits and bobs. I mean, but I'll give you an example of the attention to detail. This is a good way to describe it. Mm-hmm. There was one point where John Burton, the drug dealer, is telling one of his many fantastical tales. I can't remember which particular bit it was. But there's a part where when they went into production of pills themselves, his kind of group of, however you want to call them, his sort of drug gang, And he makes some sort of reference to being there in Spain and all this kind of stuff. And there's a point where I've got quite a standout laugh, I suppose. You know, it's people quite often comment on my ridiculous laugh. Yes. And I think, you know, I was sort of chuckling away at what he was saying. And it was one of our bosses who was kind of exec editing it, I suppose, and, you know, the sort of final line of defense. And she got back and said, nah, you need to cut out Chris's chuckle. And I was like, what, my chuckle? Like, I sort of said to Kit, what chuckle? Because I couldn't even remember the bit he was talking about. And he played it to me down the phone. I was like, I don't even know is that me chuckling? And he said, I think it might be. And I knew what she was getting at, because, you know, there's a danger that I'm there being on their side ultimately. And I'm not on anybody's side in this whole exercise. I'm never on anybody's side, you know. I'm there to show empathy to our guests and all the rest of it. And I, you know, and I mean it. It's genuine empathy, but I'm not there to be their mate. You know, I'm not there to kind of be on their side. That's the bottom line. And I think there was the worry that I was sort of chuckling along and kind of going, oh yeah, you drug dealer guys. We all know it's all a bit of a laugh. And so, you know, that we decided to cut out. It sounds mad, doesn't it? But it kind of made sense.
Was it difficult to talk to anyone? I mean, there is such a wide range of emotions throughout the podcast. I mean, I kept thinking, wow, it must have been tricky to talk to some of these people, but maybe it wasn't.
I know this is going to sound absolutely daft, but I've done sort of the job as a radio presenter for so long now. You just get used to talking to so many different people from so many different walks of life. I don't you know, yes, a lot of interviews can be very, very challenging when people are talking about the most personal experiences in their lives, obviously. And then there's the kind of combative interviews, which are challenging and difficult for different reasons. But I don't often find interviews particularly difficult in the way that you're intimating. I think probably the hardest one was with Janet Mays's brother. And that was partly because of COVID, we're not in the same room, obviously. And I was in my living room, and it was done in a similar way to this. And he was somewhere, I couldn't even see him. I didn't know what he looked like. And again, that's not necessarily the end of the world. And we had a bit of a chat beforehand, but there was other people on the line helping with the recording and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, I do quite like being able to just settle down with someone for a little bit and get a bit of myself across so that they can feel comfortable and hopefully in good hands. Where this was obviously a bit more challenging because it was quite cold, and he has, as far as I'm aware, never really spoken publicly about it. It was a long time ago, and clearly, you know, it would bring up an awful lot of horrendous memories. But I think he did a really great job for us, and we're really, really grateful. You know, I always think, how would you feel if you just suddenly got a random call out of the blue from some people at the BBC saying, I know you haven't spoken about this for ages, but do you fancy it? You know, right. I'm not even sure I would say yes. I'd probably say, no, you're all right. And so I'm always so grateful for people who, you know, he's not getting paid. You know, he's putting his neck on the line. He's putting his trust in us as well. And, you know, you've got to be so grateful for people like that, just who ultimately, I suppose, want to accurately represent what happened and show the proper respect to the person in their life who lost their life.
Yeah. If we can change tack, it is based so much on the music.
Yeah.
So who got to choose which tunes you were going to play in the background?
Well, this is, you know, Kieran is a absolute metaler, right? He is, okay. Honestly, he knows so much about metal. It's ridiculous. He even had he's from Northern Ireland, and he had a really well-known website that he curated that was all about heavy metal. So he's the metal man. And when we did the End of Days podcast, he picked the music for that, and it was great. It was so atmospheric, and it was by a band called Earth. I don't know if you're familiar with those guys. They were friends with like Nirvana and stuff like that. In fact, I think one of the guys from Earth gave the gun to Kurt Cobain that he used to kill himself, but that's by the by.
Right.
Now, when we moved on to this one, I've always, he knows that I'm much more into that side of music. I've always been into house music. And it was an absolute education for Kieran. But you see, the thing is, he's a music lover. He likes a lot of folk music and stuff like that as well. And if you hear good music, even if it's not the stuff that you have always been into, you recognize good music. And I know Kieran really loves the idea of a counterculture as well. So as he was finding out more and more about this kind of amazing, moment in our history and the music that came with it, I think he kind of became slightly intoxicated by it all. And he would go away and go, "Have you heard this Future Acid Tracks? Have you heard this tune?" I go, "Of course I bloody heard it. I've heard it 1,000,001 times, mate." But he was brilliant in picking out different tunes that I might not necessarily have thought would have worked. But yeah, I was constantly just texting him going, "This needs to be in, this needs to be in." And I talked to Emma Ford, who was the producer of the pod as well. And I'd go, "I'm worried that Kieran's going to leave this out. Can you put a little bit of pressure on him to make sure we definitely include it?" But he doesn't listen to me anyway. But there was one in particular, which is "Rich in Paradise" by the FPI Project. And I remember my brother booming that out when we were still living at home with my mum, because he was of that age. And I said to Kieran, this has got to be included. And it just comes in beautifully at the end of the first episode. And it sounds awesome, actually, the production of it. And I say something like, "So begins our story," and the characters that you will learn more about, or whatever it is. And I love listening to that bit because I have such great affinity for that tune. And it's one of those ones, if it came on in your headphones and you're walking down the street, I used to walk around London with my headphones, and you just think, yeah, when it's the right tune, and you're loving life, aren't you? It's one of those. And so it's an important tune for me. And so for it to be a part of the pod at that particular moment is great. But, we were absolutely spoiled for choice. And there's so many great tunes from that period. And Graham Park, who features in the podcast, seminal character from that period, and just a lovely, lovely bloke as well, Graham. And I sort of vaguely got to know him because he's a big listener to Five Live as well. So that's weird. All these people who I've kind of revered from afar, and now it's suddenly like, "All right, Graham, how you doing?" And it's all like that. And then he did this wicked mix for us at the end of the whole thing, which has just been great as well. So it's all come together beautifully.
In the last episode, and I'm going to paraphrase you now, but you said, what do you think is that period's lasting legacy on British culture? And I'm kind of turning the question onto you. And what do you think?
Well, I think there's different ways of looking at it, isn't there? Because on a practical level, the legacy was a complete change in the licensing laws of this country, which kind of sounds boring in a way. But if you were talking about clubs closing at 2 a.m. and then people choosing to go to illegal raves as a result of that, the legislation that then followed brought people inside, right? So it was the combination of the Criminal Justice Act and the need to change things because of people engaged in illegal raves. That brought people inside. Suddenly clubs were open till 5, 6, 7 in the morning, whatever. And that changed things forever. And in fact, changed the whole nighttime culture of this country, I think, as well. The nighttime economy, even the idea of more kind of al fresco eating and all that kind of stuff. I think that was, you could almost sort of, bring that in a kind of linear part of this, but it also brought more of an individualism to nightlife. Now, don't get me wrong, of course that used to happen in the old days, right, with teddy boys or punks or whatever it might have been. But in terms of clubbing, I think it really sort of changed things in terms of nightlife, because again, a lot of people reflect on the fact that if you're talking about the early 1980s, which I was too young to remember, but I still remember a lot of clubs of this kind of nature, it would have been people in smart shoes, smart trousers, button-up shirt, dancing terribly and just on the pull. and all that kind of thing. And this completely changed that, blew it out of the water. And clubbing and nightlife in this country has never been the same since. Now, the whole sort of idea of whether it changed, attitudes and maybe, a cultural revolution and such. People argue that point, don't they? People argue that point. I don't know if I'm in a good enough position, if I'm honest, to make a proper kind of assessment of that. So I wouldn't want to step into territory which people have written thesis about and PhDs. I mean, that's a big question to answer. But sure, I mean, it freed up people's sense of expression in a way that we probably haven't seen in this country before then.
So what's next? I mean, is there a sequel coming? Are you and Danny headed to Netflix for Ecstasy Goes to Hollywood, or what's...
Well, it's funny you ask that, because I don't know, these things keep happening where when we did End of Days, there's been big moves towards making a drama out of that. I know there's proper steps that are happening that might end up on the TV sometime relatively soon, which would be mad. And then similarly with this, there's been interest from people who want to turn it into a TV drama, which would be very, very cool to see. Funnily enough, I don't think I would have anything to do with that whatsoever. Working for the BBC as a member of staff, you kind of lose control of these things, but it would be quite amazing to see. I don't know is the absolute honest answer. And these things don't really grow on trees. To pick the right idea is a difficult one. And I suppose it when you see it. We've had quite a lot of messages from people saying, you got to do the next step of the whole rave culture. You got to do that 90s period and get into that, and the super clubs and what happened with the commercialization of it all. I don't think so. It doesn't feel like it's got the same kind of, I don't know. I think we'd struggle to find the same sort of characters and the same sort of narrative. And it just doesn't feel like as exciting a period of time. I guess it would have been, obviously, for the people who were there, they would have absolutely loved it. But I think the dawning of that period is what makes it so exciting to get behind, if you like. But it's the same as when we did End of Days. As soon as we did that, people were like, you're going to do another cult story, you're going to do the Jonestown massacre now, and you go, yeah, maybe. I think it's better if you can find something else entirely new. I think that's a good thing to do. But I do like this idea of finding a moment in history, cultural history, that people think they know the story to, but there's a lot more, hidden away that perhaps hasn't been told. But like I say, these things aren't that easy to find, really. And particularly, part of the problem, I think, is in this country. I think that's why quite a lot of podcasts seek out stories from the States. And that was what happened with our first podcast, because there's, so many different stories from so many different parts of the States. And sometimes these really are kind of pretty untold stories. But in this country, it's harder, isn't it? If something becomes a story, then most people kind of know about it. We're not that big a country. So the challenge is there. And hopefully, if we talk again in 6 months' time, I'll know exactly what we're doing and hopefully be on the way to making it.
Well, on that note, really enjoyed today. We would love to have you back. Thank you very much, Chris Warburton.
Thank you. Thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
So, thanks very much to Chris Warburton for talking to MetaPod about the dawn of acid house music and rave culture as captured in his podcast, Ecstasy, the Battle of Rave. We certainly enjoyed his humor and infectious laugh, and if you think you might be that guy in the podcast artwork for Ecstasy, drop us a note at metapodshow.com. We've got a few questions for you.
Indeed, it's worth just pointing out, I have checked with all of my old dim and distant past raving buddies, and it's none of them. And it's not me either. But yeah, we would love to hear from that person if they want to admit that it is them, and find out if they can indeed remember the photograph being taken, I guess.
Yes, so the search for the Ecstasy guy goes on.
It does.
If you haven't yet listened to Ecstasy, the Battle of Rave, you can get it on all major podcast platforms and at BBC Radio 5 Live website, where you'll also find an excellent track list of tunes that appear in each episode of Ecstasy.
So that's a kind of an invitation for people to listen to the music, get their old dust out, their old glow sticks. I guess.
Glitter.
Do you still have some glow sticks, Wendy?
I do not.
Okay, nor do I.
Christmas is coming up. You can join the conversation about this podcast by using the hashtags Battle of Rave and Chris Warburton _ on Twitter. If you enjoyed our interview with Chris, why not throw in the hashtag MetaPod while you're at it? Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.